Truman Cole never suspected that his entire future would hinge on a single apple pie. The day was icy, the chill so sharp it seemed to slice through even the thickest coat, and he could hardly keep his fingers from going numb as he set out his folding table at the side of the country road. He had no idea that a lone traveler, stumbling along with no money and barely any warmth, would lead him to a turning point he had only ever dreamed of. Before we carry on, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit the subscribe button for something special tomorrow. Truman Cole's life revolved around coaxing a living from land that most people had given up on. The farm rested on a modest 80-acre plot just on the outskirts of the small, nondescript town. It was the same property where his grandparents had once thrived, growing fresh produce and keeping livestock that roamed lush fields. But times had shifted, the soil had eroded, and generations of debt had piled onto a man who only wanted to keep his family legacy afloat. At his age, nearing his mid-50s, Truman stood tall but with weary shoulders that bore more than just physical burdens. He had lines etched into his face from years of squinting in the sun and nights of restless worry, yet there was a persistent warmth in his brown eyes whenever he greeted neighbors or offered a friendly wave on the roadside. His routine rarely changed. He rose before dawn, fed his few remaining animals, then checked on his vegetable patches and orchard. The orchard was mostly neglected now, with half the trees barren and the rest producing apples too small to command a decent price at the local market. Nevertheless, Truman refused to cut them down because he remembered the days of his childhood, climbing among those branches in search of the sweetest fruit. That orchard once provided bushels of apples that his grandmother would bake into pies, crisp and golden, filling the farmhouse with an aroma he still associated with home. Over the years, he learned the old family recipe and found that it comforted him to keep that tradition alive, especially when money was tight. He sold those homemade apple pies on weekends, setting up a rickety table by the highway in hopes that passing drivers would stop and buy one. It was not exactly a lucrative venture, but once in a while, someone would appreciate the taste of nostalgia baked into each crust. He also tried to sell vegetables and a few jars of homemade preserves, although the yields were never enough to cover the mortgage payments. The local bank had been sending ominous letters, each one hinting more strongly that foreclosure loomed if he did not find a way to settle his debts. Truman fought panic each time he opened those envelopes, steeling himself with the memory of how his grandparents had worked themselves to the bone to keep this place alive. Somehow, he told himself, he would manage, although each day felt like a test of faith. On that frigid morning, the sun never seemed to fully warm the sky, which was blanketed by low-hanging gray clouds. Truman bundled himself in a thick flannel jacket and a pair of gloves that had seen better days. He pulled his old pickup truck to the side of the rural highway, the truck's engine coughing in protest at the cold. He set up his folding table near the ditch, placing a checkered cloth on top, and arranging his apple pies in neat rows, each labeled with a small handwritten tag. He had managed to bake 8 pies the evening before, using the last of his stored apples. It was all he could afford, since flour and sugar now cost more than ever, and his orchard harvest had been dismal this season. He hoped that travelers heading into the town might see the sign he propped up, homemade apple pies, fresh from the farm. He kept his hands in his pockets, occasionally blowing warm air into his gloves as he waited, scanning the road for potential customers. A few cars rumbled by in the distance, trailing exhaust into the frosty air, but none pulled over. He sighed, reminding himself that patience was part of the job. When times were particularly rough, he considered giving up the roadside stand altogether, but something in him resisted. That orchard, those pies, and the memory of better days felt like the last threads tying him to his heritage. Letting them go would be an admission of failure he was not ready to make. After an hour of standing in the cold, he felt the sting of the wind intensify, whipping across the fields with an almost cruel edge. He tugged his collar higher, blinking away the dryness in his eyes. That was when he noticed a figure approaching from down the highway. At first, he thought it was just a blur in the distance, maybe a stray runner or someone whose car had broken down. But as the shape drew closer, he realized it was a woman, struggling along in a thin coat that was woefully inadequate for the weather. She had a knitted hat pulled low on her head, and her hands were buried in her pockets, shoulders hunched as though trying to deflect the cold. Truman felt a pang of concern. The morning was brutally frigid, and anyone on foot would quickly become chilled to the bone. As she came near, he saw that she was younger than him by at least a couple of decades, though the exhaustion in her posture made her seem older. She had dark hair peeking from beneath the hat, and her cheeks were ruddy from the wind. She paused upon seeing the table of pies, her gaze drawn to the sign proclaiming homemade goodness. Truman offered a polite nod, stepping forward from where he stood near the truck. "Morning," he said quietly. "Not the best weather for a walk. Everything all right?" She let out a tremulous breath, her voice coming out shaky. "Car broke down about a mile back. No service on my phone. I was trying to find help, but this highway feels endless." She gave a weak smile. "Didn't expect to see a pie stand, that's for sure. Though it smells amazing." He glanced at the wind-chapped condition of her face, in the meager coat she wore. Clearly, she had not planned on being stranded in freezing conditions. A flicker of empathy lit inside him. "You look cold," he noted gently. "And hungry, too, if you don't mind me saying. Let me guess, you didn't plan on walking all morning?" She gave a half laugh, half sigh. "No, definitely not. I'm starving, actually. I haven't eaten since last night. I was hoping to reach the next gas station or something." Truman looked at his pies, their aroma enticing even to him. His stomach grumbled in sympathy for her situation. He had baked 8 pies, hoping to sell them for a few dollars each. That money might cover a small portion of his monthly feed costs for the animals. Yet the sight of this freezing stranger, clearly in distress, tugged at him. "Well," he said, reaching for one of the pies, "I've got apple pies, just pulled from the oven last night. If you want one, you're welcome to it." She hesitated, wincing. I don't have any money on me. Not even a few coins. My wallet's in the car, or maybe I lost it on the road. I can't pay you." He nodded in understanding. "That's all right. You need something warm. Here." He handed her a pie, still in its tinfoil dish. "It's my last one, actually. I mean, the last one that's unwrapped. I was planning to keep it for myself in case I got hungry, but you look like you need it more." Her eyes widened, tears of gratitude shimmering as she reached out for the pie. "I can't thank you enough," she whispered, her breath turning into small puffs of vapor in the frosty air. I promise. I'll repay you somehow. This is so kind." Truman forced a small smile, though he felt a mild sting. He needed the money from that pie, but his conscience would not let him watch her starve. "Don't worry about it," he said, noticing how her hands shook as she peeled back the foil, inhaling the sweet aroma of cinnamon and apples. "I figure you're in no position to pay right now, and I'm just glad I can help. If you manage to get your car fixed, maybe stop by with a couple of dollars next time. But if not, no harm done." She nodded, thanking him repeatedly, then took a careful bite of the pie, closing her eyes as if savoring the warmth and sweetness that flooded her taste buds. Truman recognized that expression, the one people wore when tasting genuine comfort, that intangible sense of home carried in each slice. He felt a flicker of pride that his grandmother's recipe could still evoke that reaction. She devoured half the pie in hurried bites, as though she had been on the edge of collapse from hunger. Then, with a calmer demeanor, she introduced herself simply by first name, though the wind seemed to snatch the sound away, leaving Truman uncertain if he heard it correctly. She asked if he might direct her to the nearest phone. Truman pointed down the road, explaining that the next town was a good 5 miles away, but if she waited, he could pack up soon and give her a lift in his pickup. She looked torn, glancing at the time on her phone's dead screen. Finally, she said that walking 5 miles in the cold was probably unwise, so she agreed to wait. For the next hour, he and the woman made small talk. She asked about his pies, complimenting the texture of the crust, the balance of cinnamon and sugar. He explained that he used apples from the orchard, along with a pinch of nutmeg, always relying on his grandmother's instructions. She smiled faintly, though there was a certain distant sadness in her eyes that he noticed when she thought he was not looking. He wondered about her life, what brought her to these parts, why she was traveling alone, and whether she was in more trouble than just a broken car. But he did not pry, and she did not volunteer details. Eventually, once he realized no one else was coming to buy pies in such dismal weather, he folded up his table, loaded the remaining pies all unsold into the back of his truck, and gestured for her to climb into the passenger seat. She hesitated, perhaps out of caution, but the frigid wind seemed to remind her of the urgency, so she got inside. The heater in the old pickup was spotty at best, but it was better than standing outside. Truman coaxed the engine to turn over, cringing at the rattling noise, then pulled onto the road. He drove slowly, mindful of the possibility of black ice. She clutched the pie plate in her lap, nibbling the rest of the pastry with genuine appreciation. Every few minutes, she offered another quiet thank you, her voice subdued. Eventually, after traveling a mile or so, she asked if he would mind dropping her at a gas station or mechanic's garage. She said she had friends who could wire her money or come get her if needed. Truman nodded, respecting her desire to remain as independent as possible. When they reached the outskirts of town, he parked at a small service station with a worn sign proclaiming tire repairs and towing. She hopped out, shivering again, though less violently than before. Turning to face him, she pressed a trembling hand to her chest and said, "I won't forget this, really, I promise. Thank you for the pie, it was everything I needed right now." He tried to wave off her gratitude. "Just pay it forward, if you get the chance," he said, quoting a line his grandmother used to say. She nodded, stepping back onto the curb. He watched her vanish into the station, presumably to call for help, then drove away, letting out a long exhale. He felt a pang of regret that he had given away his final pie, yet also a quiet sense of satisfaction that he had done right by someone in need. If that meant he would go home a few dollars shorter, well, he had lived with financial strain for so long that another small loss seemed trivial. That night, the cold persisted, and Truman, after performing his chores by lantern light, heated a simple dinner of leftover vegetables. The house felt drafty, so he wore a thicker sweater to bed. Sleep came in uneasy fits, haunted by the usual stress of money and the new recollection of the young woman who had devoured his pie. He wondered if she found safety, if her car was fixed, or if she was sleeping somewhere in an unfamiliar motel. He prayed silently for her well-being, thinking it must be a tough spot to be alone and stranded. Then exhaustion claimed him. Several days passed uneventfully, and he almost forgot the encounter. He busied himself pruning a few fruit trees in the orchard, hoping that next season might bring a better yield. He also tried a new dough technique for his apple pies, experimenting with different flour blends to see if he could achieve flakier crusts. Anything to stand out at the roadside stand. He was determined to keep trying, even if the odds seemed stacked. The local diner sometimes bought 2 or 3 pies from him to serve as desserts, but that arrangement was irregular, and the payment was modest. The bigger grocery chains near the city demanded consistent volume that he could not deliver. Life was a cycle of small hopes and small letdowns. One evening, after returning from hauling feed, he found a sleek black car parked in front of the farmhouse. This startled him. Visitors were rare. He approached warily, noticing it was a light model sedan with tinted windows. Before he could knock on the driver's window, the passenger door opened, and out stepped the same woman, though she looked entirely different. Instead of a thin coat, she wore a tailored winter jacket with a stylish cut, and her boots, scarf, and gloves all matched. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a glossy magazine ad for winter fashion. Truman stood, momentarily frozen in confusion. "Well," he said finally, regaining his composure, "this is a surprise." She offered a small, apologetic smile. "Yes, it is. I'm sorry to show up unannounced. May I come in?" "I promised to explain." His curiosity ablaze, he nodded and led her inside, pushing open the rickety screen door. The living room was tidy but worn, the furniture sagging under years of use, and the walls bearing old family photos. The house was cold, so he turned on a small space heater near the couch, gesturing for her to sit. She glanced around, clearly taking in the modest surroundings, her expression unreadable. Then, she sat and clasped her hands. Truman settled into the armchair across from her, heart hammering in his chest. He wondered what could have prompted this sudden reappearance in such upscale attire, and with a fancy car. She took a breath, as though gathering courage. First, let me properly introduce myself. My name is Adelaide. When you met me by the roadside, well, I was traveling incognito for reasons I won't bore you with. The truth is that I'm the owner of a regional restaurant chain called Hilltop Savor. We have multiple locations across several states, serving home-style meals. The reason I was out here was complicated, partly to scout farmland, partly for personal reflection. I wasn't expecting car trouble or to end up starving in the cold. Then, as you know, you saved me by offering your last apple pie. Truman stared at her in astonishment. Hilltop Savor was not just a local diner brand. He recalled seeing their commercials claiming fresh, farm-to-table ingredients. They were significantly larger, with multiple outlets in both rural towns and some city suburbs. He tried to reconcile that fact with the memory of her trembling at his roadside stand. "You own Hilltop Savor?" he repeated slowly. "That's bigger than I realized. I've heard your ads." Realizing how that might sound, he added, "I didn't expect, well, obviously, I didn't expect that." Adelaide pressed her palms together. "I know. It's quite a leap. After I managed to get my car fixed and made it back to a safe location, I kept thinking about that pie you gave me. It wasn't just tasty. It was remarkable. Easily one of the best apple pies I've ever had, and I've tasted pies from multiple culinary experts across the region. The flavor, the texture, the honest simplicity reminded me of my grandmother's baking. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I remembered your kindness. You had so little to gain, yet you gave me everything I needed at that moment. I decided I wanted to find you, to see if you might be interested in a business proposition." He shifted in his seat, the old armchair springs creaking. "Business proposition?" he asked, feeling a flicker of hope and confusion. "What kind?" Adelaide exhaled gently, as though the next words mattered a great deal. "Hilltop Savor is always looking for ways to improve authenticity. We claim to serve real home-style cooking, but as we've grown, we rely more on mass-produced pastries and desserts. It troubles me. I want our restaurants to serve truly homemade pies, reminiscent of real farm kitchens. I think your apple pies are exactly what we need. I'd like to discuss a partnership where you supply us with pies in bulk, and we distribute them to our restaurants across the region. We'd pay you fairly, cover certain costs, and hopefully expand your production so you can keep up with demand. If it works out, you might see your pies featured on menus in dozens of locations." The words nearly knocked the breath from him. He struggled to process the concept of going from selling a handful of pies by the roadside to supplying an entire chain of restaurants. That's huge," he mumbled, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I appreciate the compliments, but I'm just a small farmer, and I can only bake so many pies in my home kitchen. Are you sure you want to rely on me?" She offered a gentle smile. "I won't lie. It's a big jump. We'd likely need to set up a proper baking facility on your property, or near it. We might help finance equipment or staff, so you can scale up without losing the homemade quality. I've already run some numbers. If you can replicate that same recipe consistently, I believe we can brand it as a signature dessert, calling it something like old-fashioned orchard pie, or maybe referencing your name. The potential is there. People crave authenticity, especially when it's attached to a real farm story." Truman felt his heart pounding. He thought of all the times the bank threatened to take the farm. Could an opportunity like this be his salvation? Yet a swirl of anxiety rose. He had never done mass production. He typically used apples from his orchard, but that orchard was in decline. Rebuilding it might take years, or he might have to source apples from elsewhere. Baking in large volumes also demanded bigger ovens, more storage, stable electricity. The idea was exhilarating yet terrifying. I need a moment to think," he said, swallowing. "It's all so sudden." Adelaide nodded in understanding. "Of course. I'm here to lay out the possibility. We can go at your pace. I just wanted to come in person to show I'm serious. What you did for me, giving away your last pie, was more than just charity. It showed real heart. That's the spirit I want in our brand. And if I can help your farm thrive in the process, well, it's a win-win. The conversation continued for over an hour. Adelaide explained that Hilltop Saver operated about 50 restaurants across 4 states, each with a loyal customer base that valued comfort food. She wanted to introduce a new dessert line under a Farm Fresh Heritage brand, starting with Truman's Pies. In time, if it succeeded, they might add other items, maybe cobblers or fruit crisps, but the apple pie was the priority. She offered to send a small team to assess the orchard, see if it could be revived or expanded, and to discuss logistics of building a separate baking facility. She also assured him that if he needed more apples than his orchard could provide, they'd help him source them from local growers, as long as he oversaw quality and flavor. The key was that the pies must remain as homemade tasting as possible, without cheap shortcuts. Truman listened, occasionally interjecting questions: how payments would work, whether he retained ownership of recipes, if there would be contract obligations. Adelaide had come prepared, pulling a folder of preliminary outlines from her leather bag. At times, he found himself marveling at her transformation. The hungry, freezing stranger from the roadside now exuded the calm confidence of an experienced entrepreneur. Yet he still saw a glimmer of gratitude in her eyes, as though she had not forgotten the humility of that day. Eventually, the discussion wound down, and Adelaide rose to leave. Truman noticed that outside, dusk had settled, painting the sky in lavender and orange tones. She turned to him before stepping through the door, saying, "Thank you for hearing me out. I know it's a lot to take in. There's no pressure to sign anything right away. I'll be in town for a couple of weeks, handling other business. Please think it over, talk to whomever you trust, and let me know if you're ready to move forward." He walked her to the black sedan, the cold creeping back into his bones. "I appreciate the opportunity," he said earnestly, "though I'm half convinced I'm dreaming. If this is real, it could save my farm." He paused, then added with a small smile, "And not to be pushy, but I do wonder, what if I can't meet the demand? I don't want to fail and ruin your brand's reputation." She patted his arm gently. "We'll support you with resources, training, staff, whatever's needed to help you succeed. I have faith in your recipe and your heart. That's enough for me to believe we can figure out the rest." With that, she slipped into the car, and the engine purred away into the twilight, leaving Truman standing beneath the frosty sky, folder in hand, wondering if his life had just turned a corner. He spent that night hardly sleeping, mind racing with possibilities. Could he transform his orchard, battered as it was, into a robust apple haven? He had so many questions about permits, about hiring a small team to bake. The local health codes alone might be complicated. Yet overshadowing all the worry was a bright thread of hope. This might be the break he had yearned for, a way to hold on to the land while honoring the memory of those apple pies his grandmother once placed on the windowsill to cool. The thought made him smile into the darkness, feeling for the first time in years that tomorrow's sunrise might carry promise rather than dread. The following day, after feeding his few chickens and a solitary goat named Harold, he sat at the kitchen table, reading through the details Adelaide had provided. The documents proposed a phased approach. Stage 1 would be building a small commercial-grade kitchen on his property. Stage 2 involved orchard revitalization and additional apple sourcing from local growers if needed. Stage 3 introduced distribution to all Hilltop Saver locations. The revenue projections, while somewhat guesswork, were large enough to overshadow his existing farm income. He let out a shaky breath, imagining a future where the orchard thrived, where he was no longer forced to sell pies on the roadside, hoping for a handful of dollars. He decided to reach out to a neighbor he trusted, one who had some experience reading contracts. The neighbor skimmed the folder and said it seemed straightforward, with no obvious hidden traps, though it was a big commitment. "If they're legit, you stand to gain a lot," the neighbor said, sipping coffee. "But you also have to deliver thousands of pies eventually. That's a lot of flour, sugar, and labor. You ready for that?" Truman swallowed. "I'll have to be," he muttered. The neighbor shrugged, patting him on the shoulder, remarking that it sure beat losing the farm. With that cautious encouragement, Truman dialed the number Adelaide had left for him. A polite assistant answered, greeting him by name, then put Adelaide on the line. She sounded genuinely pleased to hear from him. They arranged a time for her staff to visit and conduct a thorough inspection of the orchard and the barn where he stored some equipment. He also scheduled a day to meet with a potential facility designer who specialized in small-scale commercial kitchens. The speed of these developments left him breathless, but he reminded himself that opportunity sometimes required a leap of faith. When Adelaide's team arrived, comprised of an orchard consultant, a construction advisor, and a logistics manager, they systematically walked every row of the orchard, taking notes on which trees still produced. They measured the soil pH, discussed irrigation methods, and recommended replanting with hardier apple varieties known for baking. Then they moved to a spot behind the old barn, imagining how a kitchen addition could look. The construction advisor showed him sketches of a simple building outfitted with ovens, counters, storage, and proper ventilation. The manager explained that once built, they could scale output from a few dozen pies a day to potentially hundreds. Truman felt a wave of intimidation hearing such figures, but also a sense of excitement. He imagined employing local folks who also faced tough times, giving them a job in the new facility. Perhaps it could revive not just his farm, but the entire area. Over the next week, Adelaide visited more frequently, guiding him through each step of the negotiation. They agreed that Hilltop Saver would finance the building of the kitchen, with certain conditions that if Truman left the partnership prematurely, he'd either buy out the equipment or let Hilltop Saver recoup some costs. He found this fair, though he asked for minor revisions to ensure he wasn't trapped. She obliged, praising his attention to detail. They hammered out how the orchard would be expanded, with new saplings introduced next spring, and how Hilltop Saver could help secure additional apples from local suppliers if he couldn't meet volume. The question of employing staff was resolved by deciding that he'd remain the head baker and orchard manager, but Hilltop Saver would provide a small workforce to help with daily tasks, along with training in safe food handling. The final result was a contract that spelled out revenue shares, plus a guaranteed minimum purchase for a set number of pies each month. For a small farmer who had scraped by selling pies at a roadside stand, it felt akin to winning the lottery. One crisp morning, beneath a sky glowing pink with dawn, they signed the contract at Truman's kitchen table. Adelaide shook his hand with a broad smile, promising that once construction began, things would move fast. He found himself grinning back, a sense of relief and gratitude filling him. The memory of that freezing day when she devoured the last apple pie gave him a warm feeling. He had acted on empathy, not expecting reward, yet life had circled around to offer him a new path. He wondered if his grandparents, wherever they were cheering in silent pride. Construction started the following week. Trucks rumbled onto the farm, flattening an area behind the barn to pour a foundation for what they dubbed the pie house. The orchard consultant delivered crates of young apple trees that would be planted in the coming spring, currently stored in the barn's sheltered corner to protect them from winter frost. Neighbors watched the flurry of activity with curiosity, some impressed by how quickly the place was transforming. The local bank manager even stopped by one afternoon to check on progress, wearing a forced politeness. Truman realized the bank must have heard rumors of an impending business deal. He felt no animosity, just a quiet satisfaction that he might no longer need to grovel for loan extensions. Hilltop Saver's marketing department also contacted him, suggesting they might eventually do a promotional campaign around Truman's apple pie, featuring pictures of the orchard and maybe referencing the story of how the partnership began. He was uneasy about turning his personal act of kindness into a sales gimmick, but Adelaide assured him the approach would be tasteful, focusing on the authenticity of farm-fresh baking. "People love a real narrative," she told him gently. "And your story is certainly real. A struggling farmer, a heartfelt gesture, a new beginning. If you're comfortable, it could draw more customers who appreciate genuine warmth." He nodded, remembering that times had changed, and marketing was part of the modern business world. If it helped him keep the orchard and hire more workers, he could handle a little publicity. So he participated in a brief photo shoot, wearing an apron dusted with flour, holding a freshly baked pie in front of the orchard. He felt self-conscious, but the photographer said the sincerity in his eyes was exactly what they wanted. He wondered if his grandparents ever imagined their orchard turning into something that fed not just local families, but potentially thousands of customers at scattered restaurants. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal. The orchard's older trees began sprouting pale blossoms, while the newly planted saplings took root in neat rows. The construction of the pie house was nearly finished, the metal roof glinting in the sunlight, the interior boasting wide counters, industrial ovens, and a walk-in cooler. Hilltop Saver's staff helped him test the space, calibrating oven temperatures to match the results of his old, well-worn kitchen range. It took trial and error, but eventually he found the sweet spot for the perfect golden crust. He taught them how to measure the spices for the filling, a pinch more cinnamon than standard recipes, and a dash of grated nutmeg. A few staffers said they were awed by how he could replicate that comforting flavor each time. He simply shrugged, attributing it to muscle memory and childhood lessons from his grandmother. As the orchard consultant had suggested, the orchard needed more time to produce enough apples for a large-scale operation. So, for now, Truman ordered fresh apples from a few local growers, ensuring they met his standards. That allowed him to scale up production without sacrificing quality. Soon, the first shipment of pies left the pie house in a refrigerated truck, bound for several Hilltop Saver restaurants. Adelaide visited one of the restaurants unannounced, ordering the new farm-fresh apple pie for dessert. She sent Truman a message later, raving about the taste and how customers around her seemed to be devouring it with delight. That note made Truman beam with pride. Word spread among the restaurant's clientele, prompting Hilltop Saver to expand the offering to more locations. Within a month, the pie house was running at near capacity, and Truman hired 6 new employees, 2 neighbors who had lost their factory jobs, a local college student needing weekend work, and a few others from surrounding farms. He topped the steps of his recipe, though he guarded certain details about the spice blend, using pre-measured packets that only he compiled. He was not trying to be secretive out of distrust, but he believed in preserving that intangible magic that set his pies apart. The staff didn't mind. They seemed grateful for a job that combined culinary craft with a sense of community spirit. Meanwhile, Adelaide occasionally dropped by to check on progress or to discuss expansions. He could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she watched the orchard, newly planted rows showing signs of healthy growth. In some moments, she looked almost wistful, as though reminded of something personal. One quiet afternoon, as they strolled past the blooming trees, he got the courage to ask, "What made you travel alone in the cold that day? You mentioned scouting farmland, but it seemed deeper than just a routine trip." She sighed, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I was going through a rough patch," she admitted. Hilltop Saver was doing well from the outside, but I felt disconnected from my own company's mission. We claimed home-style cooking, but I sensed we were losing that authentic soul. I wanted to see rural life up close, maybe find new suppliers or just remind myself why I started the business. Then the car trouble happened, and I ended up freezing, hungry, and feeling helpless. That's when you showed me real kindness, no questions asked. It reaffirmed my belief that I needed to reconnect with genuine values. Truman felt a quiet understanding. "I'm glad something good came out of it, for both of us," he said softly. The orchard was alive with bees that day, buzzing around the blossoms. A breeze carried the scent of apple flowers. They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts of how an accident of circumstance had forged a relationship that neither saw coming. As the weeks rolled on, demand for Truman's pies soared further. Hilltop Saver launched an advertising campaign featuring images of orchard blossoms and a brief mention, inspired by a real farmer's generosity. While it didn't detail the entire story of him giving away his last pie, it hinted at the authenticity behind the product. Customers at the restaurants loved the dessert, praising its nostalgic flavor. The result was more orders for the pie house, prompting Truman to consider a second shift if volume continued rising. He met with his staff explaining they might eventually rotate schedules to cover more hours, and they seemed open. A hum of excitement filled the farm, the sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. In the local town, people started noticing that the orchard looked healthier, the farm no longer appeared forlorn, and the usual tension in Truman's brow had lightened. Despite the success, challenges emerged. The orchard would still require a couple of years before the younger trees yielded enough apples. The cost of production rose as well, from packaging materials to staff wages. Sometimes, last-minute changes in Hilltop Saver's promotional schedule forced frantic nights at the pie house. But each hurdle was met with a spirit of collaboration, as Adelaide or her team would step in to find solutions. The orchard consultant recommended certain fertilizer regimens, the construction advisor helped add extra cooling space in the pie house, and the marketing folks kept public interest high. Truman realized that while the workload grew heavier, he no longer felt alone in his struggles. He had partners, employees, and a company that wanted him to thrive. One day, as he was overseeing staff rolling dough, the phone in the office rang. He answered, and the voice on the other end identified itself as a reporter from a regional newspaper. They wanted to do a feature on the farmer whose pies ended up in a major restaurant chain due to a random act of kindness. Truman hesitated, recalling how he disliked the idea of turning his personal story into public spectacle. But Adelaide encouraged him, saying the press coverage would benefit both him and the chain, possibly leading to even more opportunities. So he agreed. The reporter came out, took photos, interviewed him about his background, how he learned to bake, and the day he met Adelaide. He tried to keep it humble, focusing on how he just wanted to help someone in need. The story ran a week later, generating a wave of positive feedback. Locals who had known him all his life teased him about becoming a celebrity farmer. He laughed it off, mindful that he was still the same man, reliant on the orchard and a dust-laden pickup to get by. The orchard was in full bloom by late spring. White blossoms, tinged with faint pink, swayed in the breeze, filling the air with a delicate perfume. Truman found time each morning to stroll among the rows, checking for pests or disease, marveling at how the new saplings thrived. He felt as though he was witnessing a rebirth, the orchard returning to the glory it once had under his grandparents' care. Some afternoons, he'd catch a glimpse of staff hauling boxes of ingredients into the pie house, the hum of ovens drifting through the open door. The synergy between orchard and bakery was something he never believed he'd see. Yet here it was, a testament to perseverance and a spark of kindness. Adelaide's visits became less frequent as the operation stabilized, though she stayed in touch via phone or email. Each conversation carried a mixture of professional updates and warm personal inquiry, how he was doing, whether the orchard was on schedule, if the staff needed more training. One evening, she emailed him a heartfelt note, admitting that the simple taste of his apple pie still reminded her of how vulnerable she felt on that freezing day, and how grateful she was for the bond they'd forged. Truman answered in kind, telling her he believed in second chances, both for farmland and for people searching to rediscover their purpose. Their friendship, rooted in that roadside moment, continued to deepen, even as they focused on expanding the business relationship. Midsummer arrived, bringing with it the orchard's first small harvest from a handful of older trees that still yielded fruit. The apples were not numerous, but they were crisp and flavorful, perfect for test batches in the pie house. Truman decided to create a special variety of pie using them exclusively, labeling it First Harvest Apple Pie. The staff got excited, baking a limited run and sending them to just a few Hilltop Saver restaurants. Customers who tasted it responded enthusiastically, praising the fresh, tangy sweetness that outshone any store-bought apples. The success, though modest in scale, reaffirmed Truman's dream of making the orchard the primary source for his pies one day. Then, in a development that felt like a dream, Adelaide called to tell him that a group of gastronomical enthusiasts, essentially food bloggers and critics with significant online influence, wanted to tour the orchard and the pie house, filming a short documentary on how a single farm was partnering with Hilltop Saver. She asked if he was open to hosting them for a day, letting them record the process from picking apples to rolling dough. Though it made him nervous, He agreed. The orchard consultant helped him ensure everything looked tidy. The staff prepared sample pies for the visitors to taste, and Adelaide herself planned to be present. The day of the visit dawned bright and clear, sunlight filtering through the orchard leaves, painting dappled patterns on the ground. The group of about 8 people arrived in a van, bloggers with cameras, tripods, and an eagerness to capture the spirit of farm-based dessert making. Adelaide stepped out, greeting them warmly, directing them to Truman. He shook hands with each, trying to remember all their names, but mostly focusing on not stammering too much when the cameras started rolling. They wanted to see him pick apples, so he led them through the orchard, pointing out which varieties he liked best. He demonstrated how to tell if an apple was ripe by gently twisting and seeing if the stem released. They asked about his family history, how he got the recipe, and the day he first met Adelaide. He told the story in simple terms, letting them film him recounting the moment a freezing stranger approached his PI stand, and how he never thought that small gesture would open such grand doors. They followed him to the pie house next, filming the staff rolling dough. The staff, donned in aprons, greeted the bloggers cheerfully, showing off the large mixers, the custom ovens. They recorded the process of peeling apples, seasoning them with sugar and cinnamon, and finally layering them in pastry. The aroma that filled the air was mouth-watering, and the bloggers nodded in delight, capturing close-up shots of the filling as it bubbled in the ovens. They asked him how the partnership had changed his life, and he spoke honestly about how the farm was once on the brink of foreclosure, and now he could afford new fences, more orchard maintenance, and stable salaries for his employees. The sincerity of his words seemed to resonate with them. Adelaide joined him for a brief on-camera chat, where they both explained their shared philosophy. Sometimes all it takes is one genuine connection to remind people of the humanity behind food. She revealed that the best apple pie she'd ever tasted came from a battered tin dish on a freezing day, and it had led her to reevaluate how her restaurants sourced desserts. The bloggers ate it up, both literally and figuratively, filming every angle, promising they would edit a piece that showcased the orchard's charm and the authenticity of farm-baked pies. Truman couldn't help but be amazed by the synergy that had grown from such an unexpected start. After the crew left, Adelaide remained behind, sitting with him on a wooden bench near the edge of the orchard, both of them exhausted but exhilarated. She praised his composure under the cameras, and he chuckled, admitting he was terrified. She responded that vulnerability was what made him relatable, and that customers loved the idea of a real farmer behind each slice of pie. For a moment, neither said anything, just staring at the rows of trees swaying in the breeze. Finally, Adelaide said softly, "Are you happy with how things turned out?" Truman glanced at her, thinking about the stress of ramping up production, the busyness of the new facility, the orchard still a work in progress. Yet he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "I am," he answered gently. "I have a second chance with this land, with these pies, and it's all thanks to that day. It's more than just money. It's the knowledge that we're creating something people genuinely enjoy, while preserving the heritage of this place." Adelaide's gaze lingered on him for a moment, a thoughtful glimmer in her eyes. Then she stood, brushing dust off her trousers, and said, "Let's keep it growing. You never know what new doors might open. I have big plans for the orchard's fruit once the harvest is large enough. Jams, chutneys, maybe even apple juice for the morning menu. We'll keep thinking outside the box." He nodded, rising to join her. Together, they walked back toward the pie house, discussing future expansions as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The orchard, the pies, and the partnership had woven their lives together, forging a bond that transcended a mere business deal. As the summer slipped into autumn, leaves across the orchard turned shades of gold and copper. The air carried a crispness that reminded Truman of harvest festivals and big family dinners from his youth. Demand for the pies had grown so much that the staff sometimes ran 2 shifts to fulfill orders for multiple restaurants. Yet the morale remained high, buoyed by the knowledge that every pie baked was an extension of the orchard's soul. A trickle of tourists began showing up, having read about Truman's orchard in the blogger's documentary, which had gone viral. Some took pictures of the orchard, posted them on social media, praising the authenticity and sense of community. It wasn't a full-blown tourist destination, but the interest felt validating. One late afternoon, after a long day of baking, Truman found a moment to check the orchard alone. He strolled between rows that glowed with the setting sun, leaves rustling overhead. He paused beside one of the older trees that somehow clung to life despite years of neglect. It bore a half-dozen plump apples, each one shining in the waning light. He recalled how, months ago, he had just a battered roadside stand and a handful of pies to his name. Now, thanks to Adelaide, he had a blossoming orchard, a fully equipped pie house, employees reliant on him, and a presence in a restaurant chain that spanned multiple states. It was almost too much to process. Yet every time he felt overwhelmed, he remembered the traveler who had nothing that day except hunger and a bit of desperation. He recalled the softness in her eyes, her gratitude for a single pie. It served as a grounding memory, a reminder that at the center of every success story is a small spark of kindness. Time marched onward, and as the orchard continued to mature, the yield of apples from newly planted trees began to climb. Truman's staff learned to juggle orchard tasks with the pie house production, seamlessly shifting from picking apples to slicing them for fillings. He discovered that his orchard consultant's advice, rotating cover crops, carefully pruning branches, watering at the right intervals, was effective. The orchard thrived, blossoms turning into crisp apples that set them apart from the uniform yet bland produce of mass suppliers. Each time a box of fresh apples arrived at the pie house, staff members handled them almost reverently, knowing the final result would be served on dessert plates in towns and cities miles away. The financial side also flourished. Hilltop Saver paid him a stable monthly amount for the pies, plus incentives if they exceeded certain sales targets. The orchard expansions added potential for direct fruit sales, and the local bank manager, once so dismissive, now almost begged him to keep his accounts there, offering better rates if he ever wanted more capital. For expansions. He politely accepted the improved terms, but resisted the lure of too much debt, determined not to repeat the cycle that had trapped his ancestors. Instead, he carefully reinvested profits back into the farm, upgrading machinery, improving orchard irrigation, and putting aside a cushion for emergencies. Of course, not every day was smooth. Sometimes equipment broke at the worst moments, forcing him and the staff to scramble to meet shipping deadlines. Some days orchard pests appeared, requiring quick action with natural remedies to keep the produce organic. The demands of a thriving operation meant he rarely had free time, but it also meant he never woke up feeling pointless dread. He had a purpose, a reason to push himself. He found joy in the daily routine that once drained him, because each struggle contributed to a larger story of growth and promise. By the following spring, the orchard was a riot of blossoms. Adelaide visited to see the display, marveling at the renewal. She stood with him in the orchard center, breathing in the floral scent, the petals drifting on a gentle breeze. "I never imagined it would look this gorgeous," she murmured, clearly moved. "Thank you for letting Hilltop Saver be part of it." He shook his head, with a soft smile. "No, thank you for trusting me. Without you, I'd still be shivering at that roadside stand, praying for a few passers-by. Now I get to watch these blossoms turn into fruit, each one destined for a pie that brightens someone's day." She laughed lightly, the sound echoing among the trees. "You put it so poetically, but it's true. The synergy is real. We're working on a new national ad campaign for the chain. If you're open to it, we might highlight your orchard again. Maybe do a short video capturing the bloom, showing how we keep it natural." He was amused that the orchard had become a visual symbol of everything the restaurant brand wanted to convey. "Sure," he agreed, "as long as I don't have to talk too much on camera." They laughed together, a comfortable camaraderie in the orchard's hush. The partnership, born of an unexpected moment, felt as organic as the fruit overhead. With the orchard in full bloom and the pie house running efficiently, Truman realized he had reached a stable plateau. He still remembered that he originally started out hawking pies on the roadside, simply to survive. Now, He supplied a chain of restaurants across states, employing local folks, growing apples that found their way to plates all over. The transformation astounded him at times. He recognized that luck played a part, but so did the generosity that day. He had chosen to share what little he had, the last apple pie, with a stranger in dire need. That one piece of pastry became the foundation for an empire of baked goods that was changing many lives. The farmland itself shone with vitality. Where once the soil was parched, careful irrigation and new cover cropping brought it back to life. Vegetables thrived in certain plots, though overshadowed by the orchard and pies. The staff's morale remained high, as they took pride in labeling each box of pies from the orchard to your table. Even local businesses that used to view Truman's orchard as a relic now approached him, asking if they could carry his pies in their smaller shops. He politely deferred them to Hilltop Savor, explaining the exclusivity arrangement, though he mentioned maybe in the future, a line of specialty pies could be considered. He was mindful not to overextend or break the trust with Adelaide. Every so often, he still placed a folding table at the roadside, out of a sentimental longing for the old days. He might sell a few pies to folks traveling through, if only to keep that connection to his past. Yet now, it felt less like a desperate attempt to make ends meet, and more like a nod to tradition, a personal ritual that reminded him of how far he had come. On the anniversary of the day he gave away that last apple pie, he found himself at the orchard, reflecting on the journey. The orchard consultant, noticing his pensiveness, approached and asked if everything was all right. He said he was just thinking about how a single act of kindness had sprouted into such a massive change. The consultant nodded, remarking that sometimes seeds of goodness bloom when you least expect them. Truman smiled, recalling how he had told Adelaide something similar months before. Later that day, Adelaide arrived unannounced, carrying a small gift bag. She found him in the orchard, kneeling by a young sapling, checking for insects. She waited until he stood, then handed him the bag, looking slightly self-conscious. He opened it to find a small framed photo, a snapshot of him from that documentary day, standing in the orchard, holding an apple. Beneath it was a short inscription, "One pie that changed everything." He felt a lump in his throat, blinking at the heartfelt gift. "Thank you," he managed. She shrugged, fighting back emotion. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that your kindness matters. This orchard, these pies, all of it came from a moment you didn't think twice about. You just did what was right." He nodded, touched beyond words. "You're the one who made it possible, though. I'd still be selling maybe half a dozen pies on a good day if you hadn't come back." Her expression softened. "We made it possible together. That's the beauty of it." They shared a quiet moment, letting the orchard's gentle rustling fill the silence. Through the second year, the orchard began yielding more fruit, and the pie house expanded production once again. Truman's staff doubled, employing local mothers, retirees, and even some young people who sought experience before heading off to bigger opportunities. A sense of pride and community suffused each day. Then, to everyone's delight, Hilltop Savor introduced a new dessert menu, featuring multiple variations on Truman's apple pie, some with caramel drizzle, others with crumb toppings or a swirl of whipped cream. Despite the expansions, the essence of the recipe remained the same: pure orchard apples, a crisp crust layered with love. By the time autumn came again, the orchard glowed with shades of russet and gold. The first harvest from the newly planted trees was impressive, enough to supply a large portion of the chain's needs. Adelaide staged a small harvest festival at the farm, inviting restaurant managers and staff to see the orchard in person. They laughed, danced to local music, and ate slices of fresh pie under the changing leaves. Truman's heart felt full to bursting, recalling how not so long ago he feared losing everything. Now he stood at the helm with a thriving orchard, forging a path that combined tradition with prosperity. One memorable moment occurred during the festival when a local official approached the stage, surprising everyone by awarding Truman a plaque for outstanding contribution to the community. The official explained how the farm's success had boosted the local economy, inspiring other small producers to believe in new partnerships. The crowd cheered, and Truman, flushed with embarrassment, accepted the plaque, giving a short speech about how none of it would have happened without a cold traveler in need of a slice of pie. That traveler, Adelaide, watched from the audience, tears in her eyes, applauding with genuine affection. Afterward, she found him among the orchard aisles, the applause still echoing in the background. "You deserve it," she said, voice trembling with emotion. "Look at what you've built." He gazed at her, grateful. "We built it, Adelaide. You had faith in me when no one else did." She placed a hand gently on his arm. "The faith came from your act of kindness. It's a reminder that business doesn't have to be cutthroat or impersonal. It can grow from empathy, from genuine human connections." His chest tightened with gratitude, and for a moment, they just stood there beneath the orchard's canopy, enjoying the festival's echoing hum. The aroma of pies wafted from the pie house, and the laughter of staff and visitors reverberated across the orchard. Truman silently thanked whatever forces guided that day, that choice, that battered roadside stand, and the last apple pie that forged an unbreakable bond. In the months and years to follow, the orchard story continued to unfold, each harvest more bountiful than the last, each new worker hired bringing fresh energy to the venture. Truman's pies became a staple not just at Hilltop Savor restaurants, but also at local fairs and charity events, further deepening the farm's roots in the community. And Adelaide, though busier than ever overseeing expansions and new opportunities, never lost sight of the orchard that rekindled her passion for authentic cuisine. She visited when she could, always finding a moment to share a slice of the newest creation, often under the orchard's branches, reminiscing about how fate had brought them together. Through it all, Truman remained grounded, aware that, despite the success, life's uncertainties never vanished entirely. But he also understood that resilience and generosity, those qualities he had inherited from his grandmother's lessons on baking and caring, would guide him through any challenge. Whenever someone asked him about the turning point, he recalled the day he gave away his last apple pie to a freezing stranger. He told them that sometimes the smallest gestures bear the greatest rewards, and that had he known she was wealthy or influential, he might have acted differently. Instead, he treated her as a person in need, nothing more or less, and that made all the difference. Those who listened often walked away touched, some shaking their heads at the improbability of it all, others smiling as though warmed by a secret. Because at the end of the day, the orchard, the pies, the entire transformation sprang from a moment of empathy and a taste of apple pie so comforting, it bridged two worlds. The orchard's blossoms eventually gave way to fruit each year. The pie house churned out sweet creations that found their way onto countless dessert plates, and a once struggling farm pulsed with life and hope. And high above those rows of trees, the sun rose each morning with a golden glow, as though blessing a story that proved beyond doubt that one small kindness can change everything.